You know, usually when we think about the rules that govern our lives, we we picture them clearly written down somewhere. Like we think of the employee handbook you get on your first day of work, right?
Oh, definitely.
Or a university syllabus, or like a strict terms of service agreement that you just blindly click accept on.
Exactly. And the general understanding is that if you cross a specific documented line, well, there's an exact corresponding penalty. It's legible. It's visible to everyone.
Right, and it creates a predictable system, theoretically. I mean, it establishes an environment where everyone understands the boundaries of acceptable behavior because, those boundaries are literally posted on the wall for everyone to read.
But then you read a paper like the one we're unpacking today, and you start to realize that the most dangerous rules in our society might actually be the ones nobody ever wrote down.
Yeah, the invisible ones, right? The ones operating just beneath the surface of that employee handbook. So today, we are taking a deep dive into this incredibly dense, highly provocative paper published in the Multiverse Journal. It's by an author named Steve Work, and it is titled The Invisible Weapon: Covert Aggression, Institutional Blindness, and the Architecture of Male Destruction.
Right to title.
It really is. And I want to speak directly to you, the listener, right out of the gate here. This paper is, well, it's an absolute lightning rod. It touches on really intense gender dynamics. It offers these blistering structural critiques of our legal systems, and it wades directly into highly sensitive sexual assault policies.
And because of that, we need to be crystal clear up front. Our goal today is not to play judge and jury. We are not injecting our own politics into the mix to either, completely debunk or cheerlead for the author.
Exactly. No side taking today.
Right. Our job is strictly to map the territory that this paper has laid out. We are acting as your impartial guides through a massive, sweeping thesis that honestly pulls from 50 years of aggression science, occupational psychology, neuroscience, and criminology.
Yeah, we are exploring the map, not planting a flag. And that map outlines a deeply controversial premise. The author argues that modern Western institutions, and by that I mean our high schoolers, corporate HR departments, the scientific community, our highest courts, have systematically dismantled all the historical punishments for covert, indirect aggression.
And as the research cited in the paper shows, covert aggression is typically a female modality.
Right, and at the exact same time, the author claims these institutions have severely amplified the penalties for overt, direct aggression, which is typically a male modality.
The result, according to the text, is this deeply asymmetric society, a society where one form of aggression is practically a federal crime, and another form of aggression, which can often be far more psychologically devastating, is virtually protected by the system itself.
It's a lot to wrap your head around. And I promise you this, whether you end up completely agreeing with this text or vehemently disagreeing with it, the concepts we're exploring today are going to fundamentally challenge how you view office politics, human resources, and high-profile media scandals.
Oh, absolutely.
So let's just jump in. The author doesn't actually start with some grand, abstract legal theory, right? He grounds the entire paper in a highly specific, everyday anecdote about a high school classroom.
Yeah, it's a great framing device. He opens with this story of a mother who discovers her teenage son is suddenly failing math. And it's not because of a learning disability or like sudden laziness or being distracted by a smartphone under the desk.
Right, the usual suspects.
Exactly.
Yep.
It's because he is seated directly next to female classmates who are wearing highly revealing yoga pants and tops. And the text notes that these classmates make no effort to position themselves differently when he's sitting right beside them, just, trying to focus on his work.
So the mother, who the text points out, is actually someone who reads the scientific literature before making an argument. She goes to the school administrator. She doesn't go in screaming or anything. She just wants to have a rational discussion about the shared learning environment and physiological reality.
And the administrator's response just completely shuts her down.
Just a total wall.
Yeah. The administrator places 100% of the blame on the boy's character. They basically tell the mother that her son simply needs to control his eyes, control his thoughts, and focus on the math.
Like it's just a switch he can flip.
Right. And to explain why that administrative response is so structurally problematic, the author brings in the neuroscience. Specifically, brain imaging studies like fMRI studies from Strahler in 2018 that look directly at the neural correlates of distractibility.
And the neuroscience isn't exactly ambiguous here, is it?
Not at all. The data is incredibly clear. When adolescent males who are, let's remember, at their absolute peak of testosterone production are exposed to sexual stimuli, they experience involuntary attentional capture.
Involuntary. I feel like we really need to underline that word because it's doing so much heavy lifting in this entire argument.
It is the absolute fulcrum of the argument because the administrator is treating the boy's distraction as this voluntary moral failing, right? As if the teenager is consciously choosing to ignore an algebra equation just so he can stare at a classmate.
Right, like he's waking up and choosing to be distracted.
Exactly. But the fMRI data shows it is hardwired cognitive interference. The research demonstrates that lower thresholds for sexual arousal directly correlate with a measurable bias to attend to sexual information. The visual cortex and the amygdala are reacting way before the prefrontal cortex. The part of the brain responsible for complex decision-making and focus even has a chance to intervene.
Wow.
Yeah, so this rapid, automatic, unconscious orientation toward that stimulus is deeply physiological, and it measurably degrades cognitive performance on other tasks.
So telling a 16-year-old boy to just ignore that kind of stimulus, I mean, it's kind of like putting him in a small room with a blaring car alarm and telling him that if he were just a better person, a more focused student, he wouldn't hear the noise. The noise is literally hitting his eardrums. The stimulus is hijacking his neural pathways. You can't out-willpower a reflex.
That's a perfect analogy. And taking your car alarm analogy a step further, it's not just a loud noise in the room. It's a loud noise in a room where the teenager's biology has specifically evolved to prioritize that exact sound over everything else.
Right. Evolutionarily speaking, that alarm means everything.
Exactly. The text argues that the involuntary component of this attentional capture cannot be overridden purely by an act of moral discipline. Especially not when testosterone is actively amplifying his attention to relevant stimuli in that exact developmental window.
But, okay, let me push back on this for a second because I can hear people listening to this and thinking, well, wait a minute. Part of growing up, part of becoming a civilized adult in a modern society is learning to manage your biological distractions. Like, we don't just let people act on every impulse. You can't just blame the environment for your lack of focus forever, can you?
That's a very fair point, and the author actually anticipates that exact response. The issue the text is raising isn't that boys shouldn't learn to develop focus or exercise restraint. They obviously should. The issue is what the author terms the institution's ideological reflexiveness.
Okay, let's unpack that term. Ideological reflexiveness. What does that actually look like in practice?
So in practice, it looks like an institution, in this case, the high school, exhibiting a posture that is so thoroughly, blindly committed to the principle that female presentation can never be interrogated or restricted, that they're willing to completely pathologize a boy's biologically normal nervous system rather than even acknowledge the stimulus the classmates are generating.
I see.
Yeah, the administrator doesn't engage with the concept of a shared responsibility for the learning environment at all. The institution simply refuses the question entirely. It reflexively protects the source of the stimulus and entirely criminalizes the biological reaction to it.
Right, so under the guise of being a neutral educational environment, the school is actually structurally hostile to male cognitive function. The institution is effectively saying, we have extremely strict rules for how you, the boy, must respond to your environment, but we have absolutely zero rules for the stimulus she's allowed to introduce into that same environment.
Exactly. And the author uses this micro-interaction in a high school classroom to explain the entire architecture of adult professional life. Because, that 16-year-old boy eventually enters the workforce.
He grows up.
He does. And when he enters the workforce, he encounters a macro system designed around this exact same dynamic. Female typical behaviors are treated as environmentally neutral or protected, while male typical responses are treated as a pathology requiring an institutional remedy.
Which perfectly bridges us right into the core of the paper, which is the evolution of aggression. Because if we're talking about how institutions manage conflict, we really have to talk about how human beings actually fight.
Right, we have to look at the behavioral science.
Exactly. The text dives into 50 years of behavioral research, going all the way back to Norma Feshbach's groundbreaking work in 1969, and then the massive cross-cultural studies by Lagerspetz and Bjorkvist in 1988.
Yeah, and this research completely shifted the paradigm. For a very long time, the popular accepted claim in sociology was that women are simply the less aggressive sex. They are more peaceful, more collaborative, less prone to conflict.
That's definitely the cultural stereotype.
It is. But the research from Feshbach, and later the rigorous cross-cultural validation by Bjorkvist, found that this is a fundamental misreading of human nature. It's not that women are less aggressive, it's that the modality of the aggression is completely different.
The paper summarizes it brilliantly as fists versus whispers.
Such a good phrase. Male aggression is predominantly direct. It is a physical confrontation, a loud verbal challenge, an open, legible competition for status. It is highly visible. If a man punches you or gets in your face and yells at you in the workplace, well, there are witnesses.
Right. The act leaves physical evidence. It can literally be written down on an HR incident report. You know exactly who did it, what time it happened, and what the immediate damage is.
Exactly. But female aggression, according to the research cited in the text, is predominantly indirect. It is relational. We were talking about social manipulation, the strategic spreading of rumors, calculated exclusion, and the invisible withdrawal of alliances.
And what really blew my mind reading this was that this isn't just some phenomenon of the modern American corporate office. Bjorkquist documented this exact pattern of indirect aggression across 317 different societies.
Right, 317.
Yeah, this is a deeply ingrained cross-cultural constant. It's human nature.
And the most vital operational feature of indirect aggression that we have to understand is that it is explicitly designed to be invisible. That is its evolutionary function.
Yeah.
It operates through deniable social channels that leave no fingerprints. The perpetrator's hostile intentions are heavily disguised.
Meaning the target usually can't even prove what's happening to them. And the genius, if you can call that the genius of this weapon, is that when the victim tries to describe it, the weapon itself makes them sound paranoid.
Exactly.
Like if you go to your boss and say, I think Susan is quietly turning the marketing team against me, or, I'm noticing that I wasn't invited to that specific email chain on purpose. It just sounds incredibly petty when you say it out loud.
Bjorkquist explicitly noted this in his methodology, actually. He pointed out that measuring indirect aggression is notoriously difficult because the entire point of the behavior is to successfully cover one's harmful intentions. The disguise function isn't just a byproduct, it's the weapon's primary feature.
Because it works precisely because it cannot be directly attributed to the aggressor.
Right, and therefore it cannot be directly confronted.
But hold on, let me play devil's advocate here. If I'm an HR director listening to this, I'm probably thinking, okay, sure, rumors are bad, social exclusion is mean, but isn't direct physical violence obviously worse? I mean, a punch breaks a jaw. A punch leaves physical bruises. Why should I or my HR department treat a whispered rumor or social exclusion with the same severity as someone throwing a stapler across the room?
That's the intuitive response, right? But to understand why institutions need to treat both with equal severity, the author pulls from historical sociology, specifically Richard Nisbett and Dov Cohen's 1996 work on honor cultures.
Okay, honor cultures. Let's dig into that.
So in the past, before the modern HR department even existed, the threat of direct physical confrontation, a fistfight, a duel, a loud public confrontation, served as a regulatory framework for society. It wasn't that violence was inherently good, but the credible threat of a calibrated, direct physical response actually kept the space between people honest.
Oh, I see.
Yeah, it acted as a necessary deterrence against extreme social manipulation.
Right. So if someone in your village or your early 20th century workplace decided to spread a vicious, life-destroying rumor about you, you had the socially recognized right to physically confront them. And society sort of understood that as a messy but functional corrective mechanism, used a visible weapon to stop an invisible one.
Exactly. But over the last several decades, modern institutions have completely dismantled those visible corrective mechanisms. The corporate HR department, the rise of the therapeutic model, mandatory anger management. These systems were entirely constructed to identify, address, and severely punish direct aggression.
Which effectively acts as an autoimmune disease within the institution.
How so?
Well, think about it like this. An autoimmune disease happens when the body's white blood cells attack healthy tissue while totally ignoring the actual pathogen. The HR department functions as the white blood cells. They aggressively attack the loud, direct employee who finally snaps and yells the male typical response, but they are entirely blind to the covert virus of whispering and exclusion that drove him to snap in the first place.
That is a brilliant way to phrase it. The text describes it as a one-way ratchet. The institution has powerful, efficient machinery to destroy the person who exhibits overt aggression, but absolutely zero machinery to punish the coordinated whisper campaign.
And the paper doesn't just observe this happening. It points to some startling recent research to explain why institutions have been built this way. It cites Corey Clark's 2025 research published in the Journal of Controversial Ideas.
Yes, Clark's data is essentially the smoking gun for this institutional shift. Her research comprehensively documents that female academics and administrators, compared to their male counterparts, show a systematically higher preference for harm avoidance, and crucially, they prefer social exclusion as their primary method of conflict resolution.
Wow. So if we trace the logic here, the very people who are increasingly dominating administrative roles, designing institutional policies, and writing the HR rulebooks, they're actually hardwiring those systems to protect their own preferred style of covert aggression.
Yeah.
And at the same time, they are criminalizing the historical direct responses that men used to use to keep that covert aggression in check.
That is the exact thesis. The suppression of covert aggression as a legally or professionally recognized category of harm isn't just an accident. It isn't an oversight. It is the predictable mathematical output of an administrative value system that shields the type of harm women are statistically more likely to commit, while hyper-identifying and aggressively punishing the harm men are more likely to commit.
It's deeply asymmetric. So let's look at what actually happens when this invisible weapon is fully deployed in a modern, unprotected workplace. This brings us to the research of Heinz Lehmann from the 1980s. And for you listening, the concept we are about to discuss is going to send a chill down the spine of anyone who has ever survived a deeply toxic office environment. The clinical term for it is mobbing.
Yeah, Heinz Lehmann was a brilliant Swedish psychologist who essentially pioneered the study of severe workplace trauma. He actually borrowed the term mobbing from the ethologist Konrad Lorenz.
From animal behavior studies, right?
Yeah, exactly. Lorenz originally used it to describe how groups of weaker animals, like a flock of small birds, will collectively coordinate to drive a larger threat, like a hawk, away from the pack. Lehman observed that exact same collective, coordinated hostility operating in human workplaces.
But we need to be really precise here, because people throw around the term toxic workplace all the time. Like if your boss is just a jerk or your coworker talks too loudly on the phone, that's not mobbing, right? The text has a very specific, terrifying clinical definition.
Right, it's not just everyday friction. Mobbing is a systematic, coordinated, sustained targeting of an individual through psychological rather than physical means. For a situation to meet Lehman's strict diagnostic criteria for mobbing, it requires hostile, negative behaviors directed at a target at least once a week for a continuous period of at least 6 months.
6 months of continuous targeting. It is the ultimate death by 1,000 cuts. We are talking about small, individually deniable behaviors, like someone conveniently forgets to CC you on a vital email. Someone rolls their eyes every single time you speak in a meeting. Someone starts a quiet rumor that you are difficult to work with.
And individually, none of those actions violate the employee handbook.
Right. But when they are coordinated across multiple participants over months or even years, the cumulative effect is completely devastating.
And Lehman proved just how devastating it truly is. When he conducted deeply structured psychiatric interviews with victims of workplace mobbing across Scandinavia, the results completely upended how occupational psychologists view workplace injury.
What did he find?
He found that the health profiles of these mobbing victims didn't just indicate stress, they didn't just indicate burnout. The profiles perfectly matched the strict diagnostic criteria for post-traumatic stress disorder.
PTSD. I mean, we usually reserve that term for combat veterans or survivors of horrific violent crimes or severe car accidents. But the data shows that chronic, covert social exclusion physically breaks the brain in the exact same way.
The physiological toll is immense. The paper cites a massive meta-analysis encompassing over 115,000 participants, which confirmed overwhelming correlations between workplace mobbing and severe depressive symptoms, suicidal ideation, and longitudinal causal effects on physical health, including cardiovascular disease. The psychological and physical damage is quite literally catastrophic.
And the author of this paper, Steve Work, makes this incredibly visceral by sharing a personal anecdote. Because it's one thing to read the statistics, but he grounds all this dense data in something intensely human.
He does, and it's a very difficult read.
It is. He describes working highly productively in a university research department for 2 years. He was publishing, he was thriving. And then he became the target of this sudden, invisible campaign of social and professional destruction. He couldn't name it at the time. He couldn't prove it to his HR department because no one was yelling at him or hitting him. It was just 4 years of methodical, quiet demolition.
And he describes the consequence of those 4 years as 40 years of aftershock, 4 decades of enduring reputational damage that traveled with him like a ghost. He lived with that trauma for decades before he ever stumbled across Lehman's research, found the clinical word mobbing, and realized that what happened to him wasn't a personal defect or a failure of character, but a documented clinical phenomenon perpetrated against him.
Which leads us to a concept in Appendix E of the text that is genuinely one of the darkest things I've read in a long time. Lehman's original theory of mobbing was built around the expulsion model. The idea was that the mobbing group torments the target until the target eventually cracks, quits, or gets themselves fired.
Right, the ultimate goal is just to drive the target out of the organization.
Exactly. But the author, based on his own experience and further observation, introduces a terrifying variation on that. He calls it the destruction in place hypothesis.
Yeah, the destruction in place hypothesis is where the stark structural realities of modern adult life collide head-on with covert aggression.
Walk us through that scenario.
Okay, I want you to picture a mid-career male professional. He is 50 years old. He has a massive mortgage. He has a dependent child with a chronic illness who relies entirely on his employer-provided health insurance. His spouse has a fixed local practice that cannot be moved. This man cannot simply quit his job.
So the financial architecture of his life has rendered him entirely immovable. He is completely financially trapped.
Exactly. Now, what happens when a campaign of covert mobbing is deployed against someone who structurally cannot leave? The goal of the aggressors actually shifts. Expulsion is no longer the objective because expulsion would end the campaign, thereby releasing the target from the suffering.
Oh, wow.
Instead, the goal transforms into sustained destruction in place.
They don't want him to leave. They want to systematically torture him indefinitely in an environment he is legally and financially forced to inhabit every single day.
And the text uses the word torture in its precise clinical and legal sense. The deliberate infliction of severe psychological suffering on a captive individual who cannot escape their tormentors. And the primary mechanism the mobbing network uses to seal this psychological trap is gaslighting.
It's like industrial-scale gaslighting. Imagine you're trapped in a sealed room, and the oxygen is slowly being sucked out. You are suffocating. But all around the room, the institutional air monitors keep blinking a bright, cheerful green, telling you the oxygen levels are perfectly fine.
That's horrifying, but accurate.
And if you stumble into the HR department gasping for air and complain that you're suffocating, the HR reps, who only recognize visible, physical, or overt aggression, look at you like you're losing your mind. The system's inability to see the weapon makes the victim look crazy for bleeding.
This raises a profound, disturbing question that the text addresses in Section 4. Why do people do this? Most people view themselves as fundamentally good. Why do ordinary colleagues participate in a sustained campaign of psychological torture against someone sitting just 3 cubicles down?
Right. Because you'd think that eventually someone would step up and say, hey, this has gone too far. This brings us to the psychology of the perpetrators, which the text explores through the concept of the psychopathic nest.
The occupational psychology literature distinguishes between 2 very different types of workplace bullying. First, there's instrumental bullying. This is aggression used as a tool to achieve a specific, tangible goal, like forcing a rival out of the company so you can secure a promotion.
It's ruthless, but it's logical.
Right. But then there's predatory bullying.
Bullying done purely for the pleasure of it.
Yes. The aggressor actually derives physiological and psychological enjoyment from tormenting vulnerable people. To explain this, the text frames the perpetrators around the dark tetrad of personality traits. These are 4 distinct but overlapping profiles: psychopathy, narcissism, Machiavellianism, and everyday sadism.
Let's actually define what those look like in, say, a Tuesday morning staff meeting, because they sound like supervillain traits, but the text argues they're sitting right next to you.
Absolutely. Psychopathy in the workplace looks like a total absence of empathy or remorse. They will throw you under the bus without a second thought because they literally cannot feel your distress.
Okay, and narcissism.
Narcissism is the grandiose need for validation. They will destroy you simply because you didn't give them enough credit on a slide deck. Machiavellianism is the cold, strategic manipulation of social networks. This is the person who quietly seeds doubts about your competence to the boss over lunch, playing the long game to isolate you.
And then there's the most disturbing one: everyday sadism.
Sadism isn't just a movie trope involving physical torture. Clinically, everyday sadism is the tendency to experience genuine pleasure, a literal dopamine hit, from watching or actively causing psychological suffering in others.
And the author argues that in modern, ideologically protected institutions, places where HR only polices direct male aggression, these predatory individuals naturally find each other. They farm what the paper calls a psychopathic nest.
Right.
And they don't even need to hold a secret meeting to coordinate. They just naturally align because the environment perfectly protects their covert methods and completely disarms their targets.
To illustrate how this nest operates and sustains itself, the text breaks down the people involved into a bystander spectrum. At the core, there are the predators driving the mobbing. Then, on the far outside, there are the genuinely decent people, who the author darkly notes are incredibly rare. These are the few people who might actually pull the target aside and warn them.
But then there's the middle group.
Yes. In the middle, providing the fuel for the whole operation, is the most unsettling group of all: the pleasured witnesses.
The pleasured witnesses. I had to put the paper down when I read that phrase. These are the people who don't necessarily start the rumors, they don't actively sabotage the spreadsheet, but they sit back in the meeting, they watch the target being subtly demeaned and isolated, and they quietly enjoy it.
They are part of the sadistic reward structure. The predators are effectively performing for an audience that enjoys the show.
The author uses the famous James Damore case at Google to perfectly illustrate the sheer naivety of an ordinary man walking into one of these psychopathic nests, doesn't he?
He does, and it's a fascinating breakdown.
I remember the headlines, but walk us through how the text analyzes that specific case.
So James Damore was a software engineer at Google who attended a mandatory diversity training. The organizers of the training explicitly asked the attendees for written feedback. Damore, operating with what the text identifies as the male typical reliance on direct data, wrote a memo relying heavily on established evolutionary psychology data to explain why certain gender disparities might exist in tech. The text argues that Damore was operating under a fatal assumption of good faith. He genuinely believed he was helping his colleagues understand data they might have been missing.
He thought he was entering a rational academic debate. He didn't realize the rules of engagement were entirely different.
He entirely failed to realize he was entering a hostile, predatory environment that had zero interest in his data. They were interested in the ideological pleasure of his destruction. The text calls this the tragedy of the genuinely virtuous man encountering genuine malice. He assumed the other side was acting in good faith and could be reached by empirical evidence, when in reality, the institutional ideology had granted the nest total impunity to act on their sadistic impulses under the banner of corporate righteousness.
Okay, so let's zoom out. If the workplace HR department is compromised by this ideology, and the cultural environment actively protects the predators, where does a targeted man actually turn? I mean, if your company fails you, you would logically think, I'll go to the law. I'll go to the courts, where evidence matters, where there is cross-examination, with the truth has to be proven.
Right, the ultimate arbiter.
But the text argues that the legal architecture is just as captured, if not more so, than the corporate workplace.
Section 5 of this text is a rigorous, deeply uncomfortable dissection of the asymmetry in our legal system, particularly regarding the weaponization of false accusations. The author starts by laying down the raw statistics from the National Registry of Exonerations.
And what do those show?
If we look at the data between 1989 and 2022, there were almost 3,000 convicted defendants who were fully exonerated, and 99% of those wrongfully convicted individuals were male.
99%. That is a staggering asymmetry.
And it gets worse. In over half of all those documented, proven exoneration cases, deliberate perjury or false accusation played a direct primary role in sending an innocent man to prison.
Okay, so false accusations are a huge driver of this.
Yes. Now, compare that reality to the consequences faced by the accusers. According to the data cited in the paper, only 0.5% of sexual assault complaints lead to a perjury conviction for the accuser.
So wait, we have built a legal system where a falsely accused man can spend 2 decades in a maximum security prison, a place where, as the text grimly notes, his specific charge makes him a prime target for severe physical and sexual violence, and the person who knowingly sat on a witness stand and lied to put him in that cage faces absolutely zero legal consequences 99.5% of the time.
Exactly. The author defines this as absolute structural asymmetry. Society and the law have built a massive, powerful, heavily funded machinery to prosecute sexual violence. And to be clear, prosecuting sexual violence is absolutely necessary. But the system has built virtually no machinery, no funding, no investigative priority, no political will to punish false accusations of sexual violence.
And the really terrifying part is that the damage doesn't even require a conviction. The text points out the permanent destruction caused by a mere allegation. Even when the charges are ultimately dismissed, even when the police thoroughly investigate and officially declare, this event did not happen, that initial arrest record permanently scars the man's background check.
It never really goes away.
Never. Whenever he applies for a job, whenever he tries to rent an apartment, it shows up as an arrest for sexual assault. His life is functionally ruined. The accuser, meanwhile, carries no public mark, faces no financial ruin, and in some ideologically captured social circles might actually be praised for being brave for speaking their truth, even if it was a documented lie.
To demonstrate just how deeply this asymmetry is protected by the highest levels of the establishment, the text provides a step-by-step analysis of the Jian Ghomeshi case in Canada.
Right, let's talk about that case.
Ghomeshi was a highly prominent, influential national broadcaster who was publicly accused of sexual assault by multiple women. The media convicted him instantly. But in 2016, the case actually went to a criminal trial, and he was completely acquitted by the judge.
And we need to be really clear here. He wasn't acquitted on some minor procedural technicality, like the police forgetting to read him his rights, right?
Yeah.
He was acquitted on the hard evidence.
Exactly. The presiding judge, Justice Horkins, acquitted him because the defense team managed to produce thousands of electronic communications emails and text messages from the accusers themselves that directly, factually contradicted their sworn testimony on the witness stand.
They kept the receipts.
They did. The judge's ruling was scathing. He explicitly stated that the accusers were characterized by outright deception and had actively colluded to suppress the truth. In plain terms, the accusers were caught dead to rights committing perjury in a court of law.
So on paper, you'd say the system worked. The evidence was presented, the lying was exposed, and the innocent man went free. But how did society react to catching these accusers actively trying to falsely imprison a man? Did the public demand perjury charges?
This is where the institutional capture becomes terrifyingly obvious. The public absolutely did not demand perjury charges. Instead, massive protests erupted outside police headquarters and courthouses, supporting the complainants who had just been judicially proven to have lied.
I read that section, and I literally had to read it twice because I couldn't believe it. They protested in favor of the people who lied under oath.
Yes. The cultural narrative immediately shifted to framing the liars as the real victims of a harsh legal system.
But it goes beyond just street protests, doesn't it? The government actually stepped in.
It gets entirely systemic. In direct response to the public outrage over this acquittal, the Canadian Parliament actively changed the criminal code. They passed Bill C-51, which defense lawyers across the country immediately dubbed the Ghomeshi Rules.
I want everyone listening to clearly understand the mechanics of this law, because it is staggering. What exactly do the Ghomeshi Rules do?
Under this new legal framework, an accused person is legally forced to disclose to the prosecution, and therefore to the accuser, any private records, text messages, or evidence they intend to use to challenge the accuser's credibility.
Wait.
And they have to do this before the trial even begins.
So the text is arguing that lawmakers actively changed the legal system to ensure that a defendant can no longer surprise a lying accuser with their own contradictory text messages on the witness stand. It essentially gives the accuser a sneak peek at the defense's hand so they can carefully adjust their lies to fit around the evidence before they testify.
That is precisely how the law functions in practice. It neuters the primary tool of cross-examination. And text quotes Supreme Court of Canada Justice Suzanne Cote and Justice Russell Brown, who vigorously dissented against this law.
What did they say?
They stated that forcing accused persons to reveal their defense strategy before the prosecution has even proven its case completely obliterates the presumption of innocence and violates the constitutional right to silence.
How does the academic and legal establishment possibly justify a law that is quite literally designed to protect perjury?
To answer that, the author cites Professor Elizabeth Sheehy from the University of Ottawa, who wrote a major celebrated opinion piece defending the law. She openly framed the legislation as a necessary tool to protect women from being ambushed by their own private communications on the witness stand.
Ambushed by the truth. That is, wow, it's Orwellian. You are ambushing a liar by proving they are lying.
The author uses this exact quote to prove his macro thesis. This isn't just a cultural drift toward believing women. It is the active legislative redesign of the state's machinery to make it mathematically harder to catch false accusers, simply because catching them produced an acquittal that the ideological establishment didn't like.
The institution chose to protect the weapon of covert aggression rather than the innocent target.
And it's not just the criminal courts that are captured. The text ties this identical logic into the heart of the scientific community.
Right, drawing on Yves Gingros's rigorous analysis of the policies governing the National Science Foundation and the National Institutes of Health.
Yes. Under current NIH policy, a male scientist who is merely accused of harassment, not investigated, not found guilty, just accused, can be summarily banned from serving on peer review panels.
Again, just based on the accusation. The invisible weapon is deployed, and the institution executes the penalty instantly.
Right, and the NIH has stated official rationale for this exclusion is logically staggering. They argue that an accused man, knowing he is under a cloud of suspicion, might consciously or unconsciously give better scores to grant proposals from female scientists in a desperate attempt to avoid appearing biased.
So the accusation itself creates an inescapable catch-22. If he grades a female scientist poorly, he's retaliating.
Yeah.
If he grades her fairly or highly, he might be overcompensating. So he's categorically disqualified from his profession just for being accused.
Exactly.
The system systematically assumes male guilt and treats the mere existence of a female accusation as absolute proof of systemic corruption.
The text meticulously demonstrates that the legal and scientific architecture of our highest institutions has been fundamentally restructured to protect female covert aggression, like false accusations and rumor campaigns, while assuming male guilt by default.
Which brings us to Section 6 of the text, and what is undoubtedly the most culturally explosive example the author uses to demonstrate this machinery operating at maximum capacity. The downfall of Bill Cosby. Now, you listening, let me issue a very strong reminder here, and the author explicitly states this in his text as well. We are not debating Bill Cosby's actual guilt or innocence regarding the specific horrific conduct he was accused of.
Right. The historical record is incredibly complex and emotionally charged.
Absolutely. What we are analyzing today is strictly the text's argument about the mechanics of his cultural takedown and why he was targeted in that specific moment.
The author's focus is on the mechanism of the campaign, the structural anomalies of the allegations, and the ultimate cultural function the takedown served. The text outlines the timeline meticulously.
Walk us through it.
In October 2014, a comedian named Hannibal Buress performed a stand-up routine calling Cosby a rapist. Now, what's fascinating is that Buress had been performing this exact routine for 6 months with absolutely no public reaction. But this time, it was captured on a cell phone video, posted online, and it immediately triggered a massive, highly coordinated media amplification.
And within weeks, you have high-profile celebrity attorney Gloria Allred hosting simultaneous, highly publicized press conferences.
Yes. Allred eventually represented 33 of the accusers. What followed was a synchronized wave of over 60 accusers coming forward publicly in the media, alleging incidents that spanned a staggering 43 years, from 1965 all the way to 2008.
And the text really leans into the structural anomaly of this phenomenon, right? I mean, you have 43 years of alleged serial conduct with virtually zero contemporaneous police reports, followed by dozens of simultaneous public accusations erupting within weeks of a single media trigger, almost all of which were decades past the statute of limitations.
Precisely. Because the vast majority of these allegations were past the statute of limitations, they were effectively unreachable through the constitutional criminal justice system. There could be no cross-examination, no presentation of evidence, no legal defense.
What was the point?
Which meant the actual mechanism of the campaign wasn't criminal accountability, it was public, reputational destruction via the media. The mobbing was executed at a cultural level.
Now, to be historically accurate, Cosby was eventually convicted in a criminal court in 2018 for one specific case.
He was, but the text emphasizes what happened next, which the media largely downplayed. In 2021, the Pennsylvania Supreme Court overturned that conviction and vacated it entirely. And they didn't overturn it on a minor technicality. They overturned it due to a severe fundamental due process violation by the prosecution. A previous district attorney had explicitly, unconditionally promised not to prosecute Cosby, inducing him to testify in a civil deposition without the protection of his Fifth Amendment rights.
Wait, really?
Yeah, and a subsequent prosecutor then used that exact compelled testimony to convict him. The Supreme Court called it an affront to fundamental fairness and an unconstitutional bait and switch.
So if the legal foundation was that deeply flawed, and the campaign relied entirely on public destruction rather than due process, the author asks the critical question: why was Cosby targeted in this incredibly coordinated, massive way? This is where the text moves into deep cultural speculation. What did Bill Cosby, the icon, actually represent?
To answer that, the author looks closely at the profound cultural impact of The Cosby Show, which dominated American television from 1984 to 1992. Dr. Cliff Huxtable wasn't just a funny character. He represented something highly specific and deeply resonant: aspirational fatherhood and unyielding masculine authority. He was present, highly educated, fiercely affectionate, strictly authoritative, and deeply involved in the daily moral upbringing of his family.
And the text argues this figure was a navigational star for an entire generation of Americans.
Exactly. Consider the historical context. During the 1980s and 90s, the traditional two-parent family was being systematically dismantled across all demographics by massive economic shifts and legislative changes, like the introduction of no-fault divorce.
Which produced widespread systemic fatherlessness.
Against that backdrop, the Huxtable model was fiercely countercultural. It proved on a mass scale that masculine authority, domestic stability, and paternal discipline were not oppressive, but deeply aspirational and protective.
So the author's hypothesis is that the coordinated destruction of Cosby wasn't really about seeking justice for individual victims of the 1970s. It was an ideological hit job.
The text argues that the campaign achieved its primary intended goal before a single criminal charge was ever officially filed. Its goal was the permanent, retroactive erasure of a powerful, stabilizing symbol of paternal authority from the cultural landscape.
Because it served the interests of an institutional ideology that desperately wants to dismantle that traditional masculine archetype, replacing the authority of the father with the authority of the HR department and the state.
Yes.
This text takes us down some incredibly dark sociological paths, but Section 7 might be the most chilling segment of the entire paper. The author attempts to connect all of this: the silent workplace mobbing, the destruction in place, the total lack of legal recourse, to the uniquely modern epidemic of extreme mass violence.
It is a profound, albeit deeply unsettling, psychological connection. The author begins with the established, hard criminological data. Looking at massive databases from organizations like the Violence Project, we know that roughly 70% of mass shooters, particularly those who commit violence in workplaces and schools, are insiders.
Insiders.
Yeah. They are not random ideological actors or political terrorists. They are current or former members of the institution who harbor specific, accumulated grievances against their peers or managers.
The text cites the Levin and Madfis cumulative strain model to explain this. I want to break down how strain actually works here.
Levin and Madfis outline how rampage violence is rarely a sudden snap. It begins with chronic strain, severe, sustained negative experiences in social or workplace relationships. This chronic rejection produces deep frustration, profound fear, and clinical depression.
And it builds.
Over time, as the individual is repeatedly blocked from resolving the grievance through legitimate channels, the strain accumulates until a catalyst event triggers a catastrophic, violent response.
Okay, so let's connect the dots exactly the way the author does. The text has already established, through Lehman's research, that covert mobbing produces psychological damage clinically equivalent to PTSD.
Correct. The mobbing to PTSD connection is clinically established. Furthermore, the bullying to mass violence connection is well established in the criminological literature.
Therefore, the author hypothesizes that there is likely a direct, upstream pipeline between the destruction-in-place torture of male targets in workplaces or schools and extreme mass violence events. If a man is systematically tortured, his professional reputation destroyed, he is financially trapped by his mortgage and health insurance, and he is constantly gaslit by an HR institution that refuses to see his tormentors well, the author suggests that this invisible pressure cooker eventually, inevitably, explodes.
That is the terrifying hypothesis. The psychological profile of a workplace shooter, an insider, dealing with an accumulated, unresolved grievance, often culminating in suicide, perfectly matches the profile of a destruction-in-place mobbing victim at the point of terminal psychological collapse.
It's awful.
You have a person whose life has been systematically destroyed by an invisible force who cannot get any legitimate authority to acknowledge his suffering. So in a final nihilistic act, he makes the invisible violence visible at a catastrophic cost to everyone.
But the author points out a massive, glaring gap in the scientific literature here. If this pipeline makes so much psychological sense, why hasn't it been extensively studied? Why aren't we analyzing the case histories of shooters for evidence of sustained covert mobbing by their peers?
The author argues that the research hasn't looked because the academic apparatus is ideologically prevented from looking. Relying one more time on Corey Clark's data regarding female preferences in academia, the text posits that the feminized academic research establishment fundamentally refuses to fund, conduct, or publish research that would implicate their own preferred method of covert aggression as the root cause of these national tragedies.
It's so much easier for the media and the sociologists to just code the shooter as inherently pathological or suffering from toxic masculinity than to investigate whether he was actually the victim of invisible, coordinated institutional torture carried out by the so-called good people in the office.
Exactly. The entire academic system is structurally constructed to be unable to see this category of harm. Examining it honestly would require a massive paradigm shift. It would require naming the HR professionals, the school administrators, and the quiet social networks as the actual instigating perpetrators of the severe psychological injury that preceded the violence. And the institution will never indict itself.
Okay, so after laying out this incredibly grim, airtight architectural blueprint of our institutions, what does the author actually want us to do? Is he just diagnosing a terminal illness, or does he offer a way out of this recursive trap?
He does offer a path forward. The paper concludes with Steve Work's comprehensive 5-point blueprint for what he calls symmetric justice. And it's important to note, he explicitly states in the text that this is not about removing protections from women or endorsing male violence. It is about applying the foundational principles of equality, evidence, and accountability symmetrically across all human behaviors.
All right, let's walk through this blueprint deeply because this is where the rubber meets the road. Point number 1.
First, institutions must formally recognize covert mobbing as a legally actionable harm. It needs the exact same HR machinery, rigorous investigation protocols, and severe punitive remedies that are currently devoted exclusively to overt aggression like sexual harassment or physical bullying.
That makes total sense. If the medical damage is PTSD, the institution needs a mechanism to stop the bleeding, regardless of whether the weapon was a fist or a whisper.
Right. And the author points to several European occupational models that already have robust legal frameworks for identifying and prosecuting psychological terror in the workplace.
Point 2.
Second, society must repeal the Ghomeshi rules and their equivalents across all Western democracies. We must fully restore the constitutional rights of the defense in criminal trials. The bedrock foundation of adversarial justice is the right of an accused person to confront their accuser with evidence of their own contradictory statements.
Exactly.
Legislation deliberately designed to prevent lying accusers from being caught in their lies has no place in a functional ethical justice system.
And point 3 is heavily tied to that legal reform, right?
Yes. Third, the legal system must impose severe, proportionate penalties for false accusations. A 0.5% perjury conviction rate when innocent men are facing decades in maximum security prison is not an accident, it is a deliberate policy choice.
So there needs to be a real deterrent.
The author argues that the penalty for trying to destroy someone's life with a fabricated legal weapon should reflect the severity of the damage caused. If you try to give someone 20 years in prison with a lie, you should face a massive deterrent penalty yourself.
Point 4 takes us all the way back to the very first anecdote in the text, with the teenage boy in the math class.
Fourth, institutions must desexualize professional environments to match their own conduct codes. The logic is simple symmetry. If an institution claims the authority to heavily regulate male cognitive and behavioral responses to sexual stimuli, it cannot exercise that authority asymmetrically.
Meaning they have to address the stimulus, too.
It must also strictly regulate the female typical dress and presentation norms that generate those exact stimuli in shared environments. You cannot police the biological reaction while protecting the biological trigger.
And finally, point 5, addressing the most dangerous blind spot we discussed regarding mass violence.
Fifth, federal agencies must aggressively fund objective research into covert mobbing as an upstream causal factor of mass violence. We need to completely disaggregate the criminological data by grievance structure and perpetrator sex, and we need researchers to look at these horrific case histories with eyes wide open to the reality of covert social destruction, rather than relying on ideological buzzwords.
We have been on a massive, intense journey today. We started by looking at the micro-level neuroscience of a 16-year-old boy simply trying to learn algebra while battling his own hardwired neurobiology. And from that single classroom, we trace that exact same biological and ideological blindness all the way up the societal ladder.
It really connects everything.
It does. We walk through the dark tetrad of workplace mobbing, the systematic destruction of men tracked by their mortgages, the restructuring of national laws to actively protect perjury, the calculated cultural erasure of symbols of fatherhood, and finally, the suppressed, invisible roots of mass violence.
It is a breathtakingly comprehensive framework. What Steve Fork has done here is attempt to make the invisible rules of our institutions visible. He is forcing us to look closely at the negative space of our society, to look at what isn't being punished, what isn't being recorded by HR, and most importantly, who structurally benefits from that institutional blindness.
And for you, the listener, the immediate application of everything we've talked about today is profoundly personal. You might be going into your office tomorrow, logging to a Zoom meeting, or walking onto a campus where the actual rules of survival are completely invisible, operating just beneath the surface of the official code of conduct.
You might be dealing with an HR department that was specifically built to protect the exact kind of covert aggression being quietly used against you.
The text's final warning is incredibly clear. The most dangerous predators in contemporary institutional life do not announce their hostility. They don't yell, they don't threaten, and they don't throw punches. They operate entirely through deniable, invisible social channels, protected by an institutional ideology that automatically assumes their good faith.
It's definitely a lot to think about.
Which leaves us with a final lingering thought to mull over, building on everything we've unpacked today. We have spent the last decade building incredibly elaborate institutional machineries, massive HR departments, sprawling speech codes, zero-tolerance policies, and safe spaces, all ostensibly constructed in the name of empathy, inclusivity, and harm reduction. But what if, by focusing our entire societal gaze on policing the visible, direct behaviors, we haven't actually made the world safer? What if we've just accidentally constructed the perfect, impenetrable camouflage for the most dangerous apex social predators to hunt in plain sight?